Ladies and gentlemen, this is TVP World. I'm your host Benjamin Lee, and welcome aboard the Eastern Express. In this episode, we're delving into the European elections and their potential impact on Ukraine. Now, unless you've been living under a rock, you'll know that the recent European elections have sent shockwaves across the continent. The rise of populist parties, the shifting allegiances, and the ongoing tug of war between the pro-EU and Eurosceptic forces have left many wondering what the future holds. But while everyone was busy debating whether these changes will alter the makeup of the European Parliament, spoilers, they won't, this one country cleanly watching these developments, Ukraine. And that's because the EU continues to be one of the main supporters of Kyiv since the outset of the invasion. So, without further ado, let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
The recent European Parliament elections have resulted in notable gains for far-right parties, while centrist forces managed to maintain their grip on the legislative body. The center-right European People's Party continues to be the largest faction within the 720-member European Parliament, securing approximately 185 seats.
And the main direction for Europe is clear. It's a center-right Europe, which people gave us. And that means that the European People's Party is in an important role to be ready to negotiate with all the others in a democratic way.
The elections have caused a stir across the continent, particularly in France, where the far-right National Rally emerged as the projected winner. This outcome prompted French President Emmanuel Macron to call for unexpected snap parliamentary elections.
The main lesson is clear. This is not a good result for the parties that defend Europe, including that of the presidential majority. That's why I have decided to put the decision about our parliamentary future back into your hands.
Belgium, Germany and Italy also witnessed a far-right surge.
This is an extremely important thing for us. It is a message from the Italians that says keep going and do it with greater determination.
Meanwhile, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, a member of the EPP, declared victory for her party, emphasizing the importance of the stability provided by a centrist majority.
But it is also true that the extremes on the left and right have gained support. And that is why this result also entails a great responsibility for the parties in the center. We may disagree on individual points, but we all want a strong Europe that is able to act.
Despite the far-right progress, centrist parties including the EPP, the center-left Socialists and Democrats, and the liberal Renew Europe will hold over 400 seats, enabling them to form a majority and nominate the European Commission.
And now, let's take a look at the issue in greater detail. Firstly, let's talk about the big winners in this election, the pro-European Union parties. These parties, which include the likes of the European People's Party and the Progressive Alliance of Socialists and Democrats, have managed to secure a significant number of seats. This is good news for Ukraine, as these parties have historically supported Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. But it's not all sunshine and roses. The rise of right-wing and populist parties in several EU member states has thrown a spanner in the works. Parties like Italy's Lega Nord, France's National Rally, and Hungary's Fidesz have made significant gains. Now, these parties are known for their Eurosceptic views and, more worrying for Ukraine, their more favorable rhetoric regarding Russia. The growing influence could mean a shift in EU stance on Ukraine, potentially weakening support for sanctions and diplomatic pressure on Russia. So, what does this all mean for Ukraine? Well, on the one hand, a strong, united European Union that continues to support Ukraine could help the country on its path towards European integration. On the other hand, a fragmented EU with a rising tide of populism could leave Ukraine in a precarious position. One crucial aspect to watch is the European Parliament's stance on financial aid and reform support for Ukraine. The EU has been a key partner in Ukraine's reform efforts, providing billions in aid to help stabilize the economy and fight corruption. However, this support is not unconditional. The European Union expects Ukraine to implement a series of reforms ranging from judicial independence to anti-corruption measures. The recent elections could influence how strict or lenient the EU will be in enforcing these conditions. So, where do you go from here? Well, Ukraine's future is, in some extent, linked to the decisions made in Brussels. The outcome of those elections will shape the EU's foreign policy and, by extension, its approach to Ukraine. Will the European Union continue to stand firm against Russian aggression, or will internal division weaken its resolve? One thing is certain: Ukraine cannot afford to be complacent. Kyiv will continue its reform efforts and strengthen its democratic institutions. It must also work to build stronger alliances within the European Union, ensuring that it remains a priority on the EU agenda. And while the path ahead is paved with challenges, Ukraine has proven time and again that it is resilient and determined. The European elections have set the stage for a new chapter in EU-Ukraine relations. The rise of populist parties and the shifting dynamics within the EU will undoubtedly impact Ukraine's future. But with perseverance and a bit of strategic maneuvering, Ukraine can navigate these turbulent waters and continue its journey towards European integration. And now here to shed more light on the issue is Alexei Haran, Comparative Politics Professor of University of Kyiv Mohyla Academy. Hello, sir, and welcome to Eastern Express.
Hello, thank you for the invitation.
So we are looking at a political shakeup after the European Parliament election, and we have analyzed extensively what it means for Europe. But now our question is, what does that mean for Ukraine? We do see a surge of more nationalistic sentiment, and we're wondering whether or not that will impact the support that these European nations have for Ukraine.
Well, this is a complex question. Look, in general, we may say that far right and far left, they have quite a lot of supporters of Putin. And traditionally, Putin used these parties in order to undermine pro-Ukrainian approach within the EU. You know, with left forces or far left, it started long ago when the Soviet Union existed. And at that time, the Soviet Union used far left in order to undermine Western Europe from within. But then, you know, we have the rise of far right. And strangely enough, far left and far right are united in their support for Putin. However, this support is not without reservation, and the situation is quite different among different parties of this spectrum. For example, if we are talking about alternative for Germany, Alternative für Deutschland, this party looks like very pro-Russian. And we know, by the way, that this party was even excluded from the far-right faction, which is called Identity and Democracy. And it was done by Madame Le Pen, because she needed, you know, to present herself and others in a more moderate way. So they excluded Alternative für Deutschland from this faction. At the same time, now there are talks that Alternative für Deutschland may exclude one of their pro-Russian candidates, two pro-Russian candidates, and return to this identity. So return to this faction. So this is one thing. However, we have another right populist group in the European Parliament, which is called European Conservatives and Reformists. And one of the members of this group, the party which is led by which is called Brothers of Italy, and which is led by Italian Prime Minister Meloni. And she is a staunch supporter of Ukraine. So what we may say is that there's no unity among far right regarding supporting Ukraine. So we may not say that all of the far right, they are supporters of Putin in his war against Ukraine. And nevertheless, having said that, I would say the following. Look, If we analyze elections in European Parliament, in general, everything is fine. Because the centrists, I mean left center, liberals, and center right, they will create a big coalition and they would have majority. They would have majority in the European Parliament. However, the main problem is not about the rise of far right in the European Parliament, but the strengthening of the far right at the national level, because it may have long-term influence on the attitudes to everything, to United Europe, to Russia, to Ukraine, and we don't know how it will evolve.
Right. So, like you were mentioning, the rise of the far right, as we've seen right now during this election cycle, might not pose a threat yet, but the trend, the rise in and of itself, might show some sentiment towards something that might be a little bit more grim down the line. I think you brought up something very important about the polarization, be it far right, far left. They're both not very good for Ukraine or the rest of the democratic world. Can you help us understand a little bit how Putin stands to benefit from these polarization of the Western society?
Well, it's about first of all, it's undermining the situation within the certain countries, right? For example, I think he would be happy if Macron would lose to Marine Le Pen during snap parliamentary elections, and it may open the way for Marine Le Pen to be elected, or the new leader of the National Rally Party to be elected as president of France in 2027. Again, their position will become more moderate because they would like to be elected, and they need to demonstrate that their approach is not far right, but more moderate. But it creates, so we don't know what would be the results for snap elections in France, but definitely it's not clear. It's a risky move to have these snap elections. The results are hard to focus. So this is just one example, and among other far-right groups like Alternative for Germany, they will not have majority in the German parliament. This is clear. And moreover, during the next election, there's a high probability that Christian Democrats, who are strong supporters of Ukraine, they will win majority and they will create a coalition. But the very presence and the very increase of the far-right party in Germany, in other countries, may be used by Putin to undermine these countries from within, to manipulate, to create more provocations.
Right, like you mentioned, this kind of fragmentation we see in the polarizing political sphere is going to be, as we've seen in the rise of some of these parties, is actually more of a symptom of the underlying issue. Can you help us understand a little bit what is that underlying issue that is helping the polarization, fragmentization that allow Putin to seep his tendrils in?
Okay, so when we are talking about polarization, again, I'm historian and I lived during the Cold War. I should say that during that time there was much more polarization because there were left in Europe which supported Soviet Union, which were against American policy, and the communists were very close to become members of the governments in several West European countries. And at the same time, then the far right also started to emerge. So there was polarization even at that time during the Cold War. But nevertheless, if we are talking about, yes, during recent decades, there was steady increase of the far right in Europe, and This is based on reaction towards globalization. We are talking about globalization in general in a positive way, but there is also a negative side. There's a lot of criticism of Brussels as center of supranational institutions of the EU, and nationalists from different countries of the EU, they're saying it's necessary to limit the role of Brussels. There's a lot of anti-migrant rhetoric, xenophobic rhetoric. And by the way, it's very interesting that this rhetoric is also very strong among working class, among youth, because previously these groups, they supported the left. And now they are to a great extent supporting the right, the far right. So all these are dangerous trends. So yet we still to see to what extent it will become mainstream of the European politics. I hope it will not become a mainstream. Yes, we see the increase of the role of far right, but nevertheless, still we have the dominating center-left and center-right parties. Because sometimes we may hear, look, European People's Party is also a right party, so we should analyze, we should add the European People's Party to that. And this is not right, because this is a respectable party, this is center-right party, the party which played a great role in establishing democratic institutions in the EU and also in supporting European integration. So again, don't mix center-right with far-right, with populist right, and let's remember that among these far-right populists, there are also different trends and different stances regarding specific issues.
Right. It's very important to be able to kind of differentiate them and not just lump them all in one bucket when it comes to this discussion. And when it comes to dangerous trends, I would also like to go on a slight tangent here, because we've recently got the information that the Georgian Dream Party is re-establishing their diplomatic ties with Russia. So if you can quickly help us understand how that is happening and what's the effect that it will take on Ukraine, if you can help us understand that, it'll be great.
Who established diplomatic relations with
Georgia has established a diplomatic mission with Moscow once again, and I'm hoping if you can give us a little comment on that.
Okay, so basically, well, it's better if Georgians are commenting the situation in Georgia, you see, because I'm an outsider and it's a peculiar situation for me. But what we may see, Georgia is divided. Georgia is divided between pro-Russian parties, which are in power right now, and the others, the European camp. And yes, we see the trend that Georgian government now is trying to move closer to Russia to get economic dividends on that. They would like to have Russian tourists, they would like to have the flights of Russian airlines via Georgia. So unfortunately, we in Ukraine, we do not see that this is a very principled position, because Georgia also suffered from Russian aggression, and 1/5 of Georgia formally they proclaimed independence from Georgia, but in reality these are puppet governments which are governed from Russia. So it's a pity that the present government in Georgia is actually playing into the hands of Russia. But definitely this is there are, by the way, contradictions between the government and the present president of Georgia, because she is pro-Western president, but unfortunately the power of president in Georgia is limited. So we should wait for new elections, and we don't know how it will evolve. But it shows that, Russia is very active. Russia is using its potential allies in every country, not on in the post-Soviet space, but also in Europe, in other countries like Moldova, for example, because they're waiting for new elections as well. So Russia continues to work with on the post-Soviet space and also in Europe again. So we should be very, very careful about that.
Definitely, we have to keep an eye out for the ever-expanding Russian sphere of influence. Thank you so much for your input and insight. Thanks again for being with us on Eastern Express. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
And now we're moving on to the Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you don't want to miss. The European Union has announced plans to extend the emergency protection rules for Ukrainian war refugees until March 2026. This decision comes as a response to the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, ensuring continued support for the millions displaced by the war.
With the war entering its third year, the extension is set to benefit nearly 4.2 million Ukrainians currently under temporary protection within the EU borders. The temporary protection status is more than just a legal designation. It provides beneficiaries with access to housing, welfare, healthcare, education, and the labor market. This support is crucial for the integration of displaced Ukrainians into host societies, allowing them to participate in social and economic life and secure stable livelihoods. Economic contributions by the refugees have been noteworthy. A survey from June last year reported that on average 66% of working-age displaced Ukrainians are employed, with figures in some EU countries like Poland exceeding 60%. This level of economic activity not only aids the refugees, but also contributes positively to the host countries' economies.
The European Union has announced the allocation of 1.5 billion euros to Ukraine, marking the first transfer of funds from frozen Russian assets. This significant financial support is set to be available in July 2024.
This is Vovchansk, a city currently being turned to rubble by Russian attacks. The move to provide Ukraine with funds from frozen Russian assets comes as a response to the urgent need for reconstruction and defense in Ukraine. A large percentage of the funds will be directed towards Ukraine's defense, with 10% earmarked for reconstruction efforts. This week's G7 summit will further discuss the optimization of benefits from the frozen assets for Ukraine. The United States and the EU are exploring legal avenues to direct a substantial $300 billion in Russian assets towards Ukraine's rebuilding and other necessities. The European Union's agreement to use the profits earned from the frozen Russian assets signifies a robust commitment to aiding Ukraine. Approximately 90% of the funds will be channeled into the European Peace Facility, a special fund used by many EU countries to reimburse arms and ammunition supplied to Ukraine. The remaining 10% will contribute to the EU budget, potentially supporting Ukraine's defense industry or reconstruction, depending on member states' preference.
And that's all in this episode of Eastern Express. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.